I'm delighted to be here at what I consider to be an auspicious occasion. I'm so happy that Charlotte did call this conference because, you know, many of us who have been fighting in this field are getting a little old and decrepit. You know, and there's always that bye-bye. And so we have to have something that, a legacy for all of you younger people who don't really know how all of this got started. You know, it's a terrible, terrible story of the destruction of our great country, the destruction of our education system. I mean, I believe that I was one of the last few who got a decent education in the public schools of New York City. My parents had come from Poland in the 1920s, and like all the immigrants, they sent us all to the public schools because they knew that the only way to advancement was through education. And the public schools in those days, they knew how to teach reading, writing, history, all of that good stuff. So I had that advantage, and of course that was during the Depression. And the reason why the New York City schools were still using the traditional methods of teaching, even though the progressives had already gotten started, is because there was a depression and they could not afford all of this new progressive nonsense. And it wasn't until World War II, when suddenly there was all this money available, that then the schools began going down the drain. But anyway, I started writing on education when a friend of mine came to my office in New York City, Watson Washburn, and he created the Reading Reform Foundation. And I was an editor at Grasset and Dunlap, and he wanted me to become a member of his National Advisory Council. And I asked him, I said, well, what's the purpose of the Reading Reform Foundation? Now, this was 1958, around then. And he said it was to get phonics back in the schools. Well, I looked at him. What do you mean get phonics back in the schools? How can you teach reading without it? And he told me, he said, you ought to read Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And of course, that book explained everything. For the first time, parents became aware of what was being done in the schools, how this new look-say method had come in. But I'll go through that in a little while. But first, I just want to introduce you to some of the books I've written. My latest is Revolution via Education. It's a compilation of my, some of my essays. And of course, I consider John Dewey to be the Lenin of America, you know. And all of these books, incidentally, you can get them through the internet. Then I wrote The Whole Language OBE Fraud. I believe it's one of the few books that take on that whole language nonsense. And OBE, which was created by Bloom and all the other so-called progressive gurus. And this is my book, The New Illiterates. You see, when Flesch wrote his book in 1955, and by the 1970s, the situation hadn't improved. And so I decided to write a book that would bring the situation up to date. And I made a remarkable discovery in my research. I found the origin of the look-say method. You see, I could not understand how normal, intelligent individuals could impose the look-say method to teach children to read English as if it were Chinese, that each word was like a Chinese character. Well, it turns out, you know who originated the look-say method? It was the Reverend Thomas H. Gallaudet in the 1830s, who had a school for the deaf and dumb in Hartford, Connecticut. And he devised a technique of teaching the deaf to read, that is, without hearing sounds. So he juxtaposed pictures with words. And that's how the deaf were able to, you know, gain a bit of a reading vocabulary, not much. Now, he wrote a primer called The Mother's Primer, published in, I think it was 1837. He persuaded the Boston primary schools to adopt that primer, And it created a disaster, a literacy disaster, because normal kids with normal hearing cannot learn to read with a method that shuts off their ears, shuts off sound. You see. They can't learn that way. And so the schools got rid of it and went back to phonics. But then it was around the turn of the last century that John Dewey and the rest of that progressive crowd decided to use that method because they knew that it would dumb down the American people. But that's the origin, is that a method of teaching the deaf to read. Probably my most popular book is Any a Trojan Horse in American Education, which sold at least 60,000 copies and was responsible for the homeschool movement, because parents who read this book realized they could not put their child in a public school or a government school because they knew what the government was up to, and I gave the whole history of that whole movement, the progressive movement. And as Charlotte said, her favorite book is Public Education Necessary? And this is, I wanted to find out why in this free country that the Americans decide that government should get involved in education. You see, there's no mention of education in the Constitution, in the Declaration, nowhere, because it was assumed that education was a parental responsibility or a church responsibility. And then you had the private academies that did very well. But then you had a group of statists, Hegelians. It's interesting how Hegel's philosophy took over Harvard University. And it was the Harvard Unitarians who decided that we needed a government school system. And that's how we got started. Read this book. It gives history that you will find nowhere else. And then, of course, since I knew what they were teaching in the way they were teaching reading in the schools, I knew that parents needed a book that would tell them how to teach their child to read at home. And I wrote this book, and I made it very simple, has no pictures, just straight phonics beginning to end. And the reason why I made it so simple, because I wanted every parent to be able to teach their child to read at home. Other phonics programs require you to take a course. You know, if you want to teach Spalding, you have to spend hundreds of dollars and take a week-long course. But all you have to do is read the instructions here, because teaching reading is not it's not all that difficult. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to teach a child to read.
I just want to point out that you are a rocket scientist.
Okay.
You know what he did in Michigan? He was giving a speech, and we finished with the presentations, and a young man came up and said he didn't know how to read. Remember this?
Yeah.
He was 18 or something?
Yeah.
And Sam sat down with him. Everybody else left in this empty auditorium, and I think you spent 2 hours with him or something like that, and he was reading.
Well, I've had many wonderful incidents. One in particular was even before Alpha Phonics was in print. Back in 1976, you remember when the Quincy Market opened,
Yes,
in celebration of the Declaration of Independence, and I was asked by Boston Magazine to do an article on the Quincy Market, you know, visit the various shops and talk to the owners. And I spoke to this one gentleman who had opened one of the successful restaurants there, Bob Lilly. And in the course of our conversation, he said he couldn't read. He was a graduate of Indiana University, and he couldn't read. Well, I knew exactly what. He was a victim of Dick and Jane. It's as simple as that. So I offered to teach him to read. So I would go to his office after closing hours, 6 o'clock, and I started teaching him the alphabetic system. Then I started with the short A. I said, the short A is A. And he looked at me and he says, does anybody else know this? And I taught him all of the short vowels and the consonants and all of that. He told me something that I will never forget. He said he would rather be beaten than have to read. It was that difficult. It was that painful So you can imagine the millions of children in this country who can't read and who live that kind of life of pain regardless of what these stupid educators do. They don't deserve our sympathy. Yes, there are some good teachers in the schools. I don't deny that. I certainly had good teachers back in those days. And you have good teachers today, but they have to shut their mouths. They cannot show their true feelings, especially if they happen to be Christian teachers, you know. But in any case, the point I want to make is that, and another reason why I wrote this book is because my mother was illiterate. You know, they came from Poland. She was an orphan at an early age, and they didn't have, you know, the kind of education system we have here. So she was totally illiterate in any language. I had lived with an illiterate. I knew what it was like. The only thing she could look was the pictures in magazines. She couldn't read a newspaper, and she was very restricted in what she could do. Well, when I was in college, I said to myself, I'm going to teach Mother to read. And so I taught her the alphabet, and she learned that very well. But then I hadn't the faintest idea what to do next. Even though I was a good reader, I had never been taught, you're learning phonics. Our teachers did not tell us how we were being taught to read. They just, you know, taught us the long vowels and the short vowels. I mean, we were taught and we repeated that, and that was all we needed. But English is more than just the short and long vowels. There are about 20 vowel sounds in English and different spelling forms. Well, that's what I put in this book, so that, and if you teach a child to read, that child will know our English alphabetic system. The fact that there are 26 letters and 44 sounds. I always ask the audience, how many sounds are there in English? I get strange answers. You know, one person said 1,000. When I tell them there are only 44 sounds in English, but we have a 26-letter alphabet. Well, how did that happen? Well, the Romans imposed the Latin alphabet on the Anglo-Saxons, and Anglo-Saxon was not Latin. So we've made do, and we've managed in English to create the world's greatest literature. So it's no big problem. You have to teach it systematically, step by step, so that the child learns all of the different sounds and all of the different spellings. And I do not teach sight words. And the reason I don't teach sight words is because when I wrote the New Illiterates, I did a line-by-line analysis of the Dick and Jane program, and I came to the conclusion that any child taught to read by that method exclusively would become dyslexic. The sight vocabulary is an integral part of that. You go to a school today, and if you ask the primary teacher, do you teach phonics? They say, oh, yes, we teach phonics. Well, they'll teach a beginning consonant sound or a final consonant sound. But the question to ask is, do you teach a sight vocabulary? They all do. They all send a list of words that kids have to memorize. And if you memorize those words, you acquire a holistic reflex. You look at each English word as if it were a little picture, like a Chinese character. That reflex makes it impossible for you to see the phonetic structure of our words. I will discuss some of that in my talk. But before I end this commercial, and incidentally, this is only $25. $25 for literacy. Can you imagine? It's a bargain. I also, for 10 years, wrote and edited a newsletter, the Blumenfeld Education Letter. It's now available on the internet. Just type in Blumenfeld Education Letter, and my former publisher has put all of the issues on from beginning to end, and you'll be able to read it. In this particular issue, December 1994, I wrote an open letter to Republican congressmen. We had the first Republican Congress, I think it was in 1994. And the headline is, it's time to get the federal government out of the education business. This is 94. We're still trying to get them out. They're worse now, more deeply entrenched. The headlines, the dismal failure of Title I. Did you know that Title I was a dismal failure? The reading scandal toward federalized public education. Well, that's what we have now with the standard new core. Government monopoly education and politics. The cry is always for more money. Why do you think they keep having these crises? It's to get more money. These people are hungry for money. And when I mean money, I mean billions of dollars. Do you know what the Common Core is going to cost? And it's going to do nothing. It isn't going to improve education. It's only going to improve the living standards of the education establishment. That's its entire purpose, etc. And then I have an article, 50% of college grads have low literacy. Do you know that college grads can't read? And they're running the world now. And they're hiring them at Goldman Sachs. Why do you think Lehman Brothers went out of business? Because they lost their minds, their brains. See, the American public school system does everything in its power to destroy the brain power of the American people. And it's very easy to do, which I'm going to explain now. Making Americans illiterate, a key factor in the deliberate dumbing down of America. And Charlotte knows that because she's documented it completely in her encyclopedic study. You should know that the planned deliberate dumbing down of America was started in 1898 by socialist John Dewey. And incidentally, back in those days, they readily admitted they were socialists, you know, because there was a wave, a pro-socialist wave, that even included Teddy Roosevelt. You know, socialism was going to be the utopia, the future utopia. So it was started by John Dewey in 1898 with his attack on the primary school's emphasis on teaching children to read. This emphasis sustained the capitalist, individualistic system, and it produced high literacy, whereby the average American could read anything and think for himself. That's true. You look at the books that were being published in the 1800s, and the newspapers, these dense newspapers, in tiny type. I don't know what kind of eyes they had in those days, but they were able to read some of the smallest type imaginable. Their spectacles must have been, you know, fabulous. And Dewey wrote in an essay entitled The Primary School Fetish, which you won't find referred to in general Dewey literature. They never refer to this particular article, but it's the article that outlines the entire dumbing down plan. The article said, the plea for the predominance of learning to read in early school life because of the great importance attaching to literacy seems to me a perversion. How do you like that? A perversion. No one can clearly set before himself the vivacity and persistency of the child's motor instincts at this period and then call to mind the continued grind of reading and writing without feeling that the justification of our present curriculum is psychologically impossible. It is simply superstition. It is a remnant of an outgrown period of history. See, high literacy is superstition, unquote. What Dewey deliberately ignored was the tremendous language learning faculty that every child is born with, and that teaching a child to read at that early age expands the child's mastery of language, which is the key to academic success. You know, we all have that faculty. It's in the left lobe of our brains. It's been put there by the good Lord. That's it. A different way of teaching reading had to be developed that would lower the literacy level of the American people. Dewey and his socialist colleagues were determined to change individualistic America into a collectivist society. I mean, in those days, the socialists were very open on what they wanted, you know, because nobody, you know, only the intellectuals thought in those terms. But the average American wasn't concerned. They said, these people will never get anywhere, you know. Who's in favor of socialism? Where did Dewey get his egalitarian utopian ideas? He got them from a novel by Edward Bellamy entitled Looking Backward, a fantasy of a socialist America in the year 2000. The book is still being read in American universities. Dewey's plan required that a new educational curriculum should be developed and tested in private experiment stations. He wrote, after such schools have worked out carefully and definitely the subject matter of a new curriculum, finding the right place for language studies and placing them in their right perspective, the problems of the more general educational reform will be immediately simplified and facilitated. So he said, we've got to have these experimental schools. All of this was being carefully planned by a self-appointed group of socialists who called themselves progressives. They knew that what they were doing was subversive and treasonous. Indeed, Dewey wrote, and this is very interesting, he wrote, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction, unquote. If the changes were so beneficial to America's children and society, why would they favor a violent reaction? Obviously, the dumbing down plan would have to be imposed by stealth, deceit, and lies. And that is why no progressive educator can be trusted. They have been told to lie in order to bring about their socialist scheme in our schools. You see, they lie. It's natural for them to lie because what they're doing is subversive and they don't want the parents to know. So they couch everything they do in this progressive jargon, which very few people can understand. Did they know that their new teaching methods would create reading disability and dyslexia? They found out pretty early at the expense of 4 of the richest boys in America. Believe it or not, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a great admirer of John Dewey, and he put his 4 sons, Nelson, David, Lawrence, and Winthrop, in the Lincoln School, one of the experimental schools called for by Dewey. Rockefeller donated over $3 million to the school, and what was the result? All 4 boys became dyslexic. But of course, that didn't stop the progressives from implementing their plan. Incidentally, when Nelson was governor of New York, he wrote in the Reading Teacher of March 1972, quote, I appreciate the opportunity to make some observations on the importance of reading, for I am a prime example of one who has had to struggle with the handicap of being a poor reader while serving in public office. On many occasions, he writes, upon confronting an audience, I have elected to announce that I have thrown away my speech in favor of giving the audience the benefit of my spontaneous thoughts. And usually I have added, besides, I went to a progressive school and don't read very well anyhow. This, of course, is a trial to my very able speechwriter, as well as a libel upon all of the devoted teachers and professors who saw me through the years of my formal education. It is also usually a rather popular device to communicate with the audience on a much more intimate basis. But the truth is that it serves primarily to cover the fact that I really wish I could do a better job of reading a speech or other public statement, unquote. And this man was going to become, he was vice president of the United States and was a heartbeat away from the presidency, a functional illiterate, a dyslexic. You know who read his books for him? Kissinger. So he hired Henry Kissinger to do his reading for him, or tell him what was in the books. So as you know, Nelson Rockefeller was vice president under Ford. In other words, a functional illiterate was a heartbeat from becoming president. David Rockefeller writes in his memoirs, quote, now this is the head of the Bilderbergers, David Rockefeller. This is what he says in his memoirs, quote, it was Lincoln's experimental curriculum and method of instruction that distinguished it from all other New York schools at the time. Father was an ardent and generous supporter of John Dewey's educational methods and school reform efforts. Teachers College of Columbia University operated Lincoln with considerable financial assistance in the early years from the General Education Board as an experimental school designed to put Dewey's philosophy into practice. Lincoln stressed freedom for children to learn and to play an active role in their own education. But there were some drawbacks. In my case, I had trouble with reading and spelling, which my teachers, drawing upon progressive education theory, did not consider significant. They believed I was simply a slow reader and that I would develop at my own pace. In reality, I have dyslexia, which was never diagnosed, and I never received remedial attention. As a result, my reading ability, as well as my proficiency in spelling, improved only marginally as I grew older. All my siblings, except Babs, that is his sister, and John, had dyslexia to a degree. Now, you see, note that David says he couldn't learn to read because he was dyslexic, when it was the progressive Look-Say reading program that caused the dyslexia. And that's also the same story with the Bush family. Barbara Bush, she's very much interested in family literacy and all of that, and created a foundation and all that. And several of her sons became dyslexic. But she always blamed it on the kids, that they were born with this malady. It never occurred to her that the boys were made dyslexic by the teaching method. So she goes along with this whole nonsense of progressive education. Well, returning to Dewey, he advised that a statement by psychologists was needed to give the new reading instruction program the backing of educational authority. A psychologist by the name of Edmund Burke Huey, who got his PhD at Clark University under G. Stanley Hall, was chosen to write the needed book. In it, Huey reiterated Dewey's views on the teaching of reading, and he provided an idea of how the new whole word Look-Say method of teaching worked. He wrote, quote, it is not necessary that the child should be able to pronounce correctly or pronounce at all at first the new words that appear in his reading, any more than he should spell or write all the new words that he hears spoken. If he grasps approximately the total meaning of the sentence in which the new word stands, he has read the sentence. Even if the child substitutes words of his own for some that are on the page, provided that these express the meaning, it is an encouraging sign that the reading has been real and recognition of details will come as it is needed. The shock that such a statement will give to many a practical teacher of reading is but an accurate measure of the hold that a false ideal has taken hold of us. that to read is to say just what is upon the page, instead of to think, each in his own way, the meaning that the page suggests. Isn't that incredible? This book has been used over the years in the universities to teach potential teachers how to teach reading. And is even being read today. This book never has been out of print. And of course, Edmund Burke Huey never taught a child to read. He had no idea a child would learn to read. But he was writing this book to corroborate what Dewey had said, to give it some psychological endorsement. Well, there you have the whole language philosophy of reading, well described in 1908 and practiced today as Dewey described it. In other words, the progressives knew in 1908 what kind of readers their teaching methods would produce. Indeed, Huey's mentor, G. Stanley Hall, had this to say about literacy in 1911. Hall was a socialist. He had gone to Leipzig University, and he was totally progressive, so to speak. And this is what he wrote in 1911, quote, "Very many men have lived and died and been great, even the leaders of their age, without any acquaintance with letters. The knowledge which illiterates acquire is probably on the whole more personal, direct, environmental, and probably a much larger proportion of it practical. Moreover, they escape much eye strain and mental excitement, and other things being equal are probably more active and less sedentary. Perhaps we are prone to put too high a value both on the ability required to attain this art and the discipline involved in doing so, as well as the culture value that comes to the citizen with his average age of only 6 grades of schooling by the acquisition of this art." So he's saying you don't even have to learn to read. Well, you know, I lived with an illiterate, so I know what illiteracy is. You know, she was not living a more personal, direct, and environmental life because of it. You know, she was very unhappy in not being able to read. But these are the ideas and these progressives at the time. 15 years later, a neuropathologist at Iowa State University, Dr. Samuel T. Orton, made a survey of students with reading problems and came to the conclusion that they were being caused by the new method of teaching reading. Alarmed, he wrote an article, "The Sight-Word Method of Teaching Reading as a Cause of Reading Disability," which was published in the Journal of Educational Psychology in February 1929. The journal was being edited by the very professors who were about to impose this new teaching method on all the schools of America. Isn't that interesting? Why did they publish this article? Because he was corroborating what they wanted. They wanted dyslexia. They wanted reading disability. And this is what he wrote in his opening paragraph. He said, "I wish to emphasize at the beginning that the strictures which I have to offer here do not apply to the use of the sight method of teaching reading as a whole, but only to its effects on a restricted group of children for whom, as I think we can show, this technique is not only not adapted, but often proves an actual obstacle to reading progress. And moreover, I believe that this group is one of considerable educational importance, both because of its size and because here faulty teaching methods may not only prevent the acquisition of academic education by children of average capacity, but may also give rise to far-reaching damage to their emotional life." And you know what happens to some of these kids who can't read. I mean, they become emotional messes. Their lives are practically ruined. We've even had suicides of some dyslexic kids. Unquote. What Orton had actually done is convince the educators that their new method of teaching reading would do exactly what they intended it to do: destroy American literacy. In the next 2 decades, programs like Dick and Jane, Tom and Betty, and others were adopted by the schools of America. And I'm sure some of you had Dick and Jane or Tom and Betty. In 1944, Life magazine could publish an article on dyslexia, which, when read today, indicates the incredible lengths to which the educators had gone to find fault with the children who could not learn to read by the look-say method. You see, they blamed it all on the kids. They said, there's something wrong with the kids. They can't learn to read by this method. It's not the method that's causing the problem. It's the kids. And this is what the magazine wrote. Life magazine said, millions of children in the U.S. suffer from dyslexia, which is the medical term for reading difficulties. It is responsible for 70% of the school failures in the 6 to 12-year age group and handicaps about 15% of all grade school children. Dyslexia may stem from a variety of physical ailments or combination of them: glandular imbalance, heart disease, eye or ear trouble, or from a deep-seated psychological disturbance that blocks a child's ability to learn, unquote. Heart disease causing reading disability? Was this ignorance or deliberate deception on the part of Life magazine? It should be remembered that Henry R. Luce, a Yale graduate, was a member of Skull and Bones. Charlotte will tell you all about Skull and Bones. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, some interesting experiments had been conducted by Dr. Ivan Pavlov in his Moscow laboratory on techniques of artificially creating behavioral disorganization. All of this was well described in a book written by one of Pavlov's colleagues, Alexander Lauria. The title, The Nature of Human Conflicts, Researches in Disorganization and Control of Human Behavior, published in 1932. It had been translated from the Russian by W. Horsley Gant, an American psychologist who had spent the years 1922 to 1929 working in Pavlov's laboratories in the Soviet Union. In his preface to the book, Lauria wrote, quote, "The researches described here are the results of the experimental psychological investigations at the State Institute of Experimental Psychology, Moscow, during the period 1923 to 1930. The chief problems of the author were an objective and materialistic description of the mechanisms lying at the basis of the disorganization of human behavior and an experimental approach to the laws of its regulation. To accomplish this, it was necessary to create artificially affects and models of experimental neuroses, which made possible an analysis of the laws lying at the basis of the disintegration of behavior." Why were they so interested in creating behavioral disorganization? Because they were going to impose those techniques on American schools. Where do you think ADD came from? It's deliberate. They know how to cause it. They describe it in the book. How do you cause attention deficit disorder? They show how you do it. You just distract the child. You turn the classroom into a chaotic place, and you'll get plenty of all the ADD you want. They've tested it. In describing the results of the experiments, Lauria wrote, quote, "Pavlov obtained very definite affective breaks and acute disorganization of behavior each time that the conditioned reflexes collided, when the animal was unable to react to two mutually exclusive tendencies or was incapable of adequately responding to any imperative problem," unquote. Well, you see, that's how they create this disorganization in reading because you have a holistic reflex, looking at words as pictures, versus a phonetic reflex, looking at the phonetic structure of words. You cannot have two reflexes, two opposing reflexes at the same time. One has to dominate. And so they teach children to read an alphabetic phonetic system by using a look-say whole word method. And that creates behavioral disorganization. It's very simple. Pavlov figured it out scientifically. You see. Well, anyway, one of the reasons why we know so much about humanistic psychology today is because of the defection of one of its major practitioners, Dr. William Colson, a former colleague of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. He testified how fraudulent the encounter movement was as science and how destructive it was in practice. You know, the encounter movement, big in California, you know, where all that nonsense goes on. The encounter idea was first developed at the National Training Lab at Bethel, Maine, right up here. You think that Maine is exempt from all of this? Yeah, there it is, right up in Bethel. You can go to it. Usually when I have gone to homeschool conferences in Bethel, I've always driven over to the laboratory, but it's always shut during that time. I would have loved to have gone in and seen some of these kooks, you know, doing whatever they're doing. This lab was sponsored by the National Education Association. See, the NEA is involved in it. And it was founded, guess who founded this? In 1948, it was founded by Kurt Lewin, a German social psychologist who invented sensitivity training and group dynamics, or the psychology of the collective. Lewin's work was very much in harmony with John Dewey's collectivist educational philosophy. Lewin's work in Germany, that is before he came to the United States, his work in Germany in the 1920s was also in harmony with the experiments taking place in Moscow on techniques of artificially creating behavioral disorganization. Alexander Lauria writes in his book, quote, K. Lewin, in our opinion, has been one of the most prominent psychologists to elucidate this question of the artificial production of affect and of experimental disorganization of behavior. The method of his procedure, the introduction of an emotional setting into the experience of a human, the interest of the subject in the experiment, helped him to obtain an artificial disruption of the effect of considerable strength. Here, the fundamental conception of Lewin is very close to ours. So Lewin was working very closely with Pavlov and those guys in artificially creating behavioral disorganization. He sets up a lab in Bethel, Maine, sponsored by the National Education Association. He invents sensitivity training, which is used throughout the corporate world, you know, not only in schools, but it's used in organizations, etc. Now, Lewin died in 1947, shortly after establishing the National Training Laboratory at Bethel, Maine. Sensitivity training was considered his most original achievement. Carl Rogers considered sensitivity training to be, quote, perhaps the most significant social inventions of this century, unquote. Of course, Facebook has now superseded that, you know. But B.F. Skinner writes in his autobiography, in May 1961, Eve and I were members of a delegation of behavioral scientists who visited Russia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland under the auspices of the National Academy of Science and the State Department. We saw a good deal of Alexander Lauria at the Neurological Institute. Although Lauria was the best-known Russian psychologist, he and his wife, together with his daughter and her husband and an older woman, lived in 3 small rooms. he explained that they were near his work in a library. He had a dasha. Now, this was during Stalin's time, and Stalin and the Communist Party, you see, Dewey's way of teaching reading was first adopted in Russia by Lenin's wife, Krupskaya. And so the Russians couldn't learn to read. They were producing a bunch of illiterates. So the Communist Party decided, hey, this doesn't work for us. We've got to go back to phonics. So they went back to a traditional method of teaching reading. And so the Russians became extremely literate, but they were restricted in what they could read, you see. But their high literacy led to their ability to resist communism to a great extent, the dissidents, you know, with their underground newspapers and things. But the Russians found out, the communists found out that this method was nonsense. But you see, America still has to become a communist country before they can get rid of Luxay. Now, Cuba uses a phonics method. Why? Because Cuba adopted the Russian method. So everybody in Cuba learns how to read Lenin and Marx and all that great stuff. But they're not given the American Declaration of Independence to read, or, you know, The Wealth of Nations and books like that. But so that's how America is even in worse shape than the worst communist countries. And then he writes, he says, Skinner discussed the idea of setting up Walden II with Lauria. So he's working with these communists, setting up Walden II. Skinner was also well acquainted with Kurt Lewin. He writes, quote, Kurt Lewin was up here a month or two ago. That was in 1938. Have you seen his new book? He diagrammed several lever pressing situations and did the same for me for 2 or 3 hours. You know what the lever pressing is? He is sure we agree, but fundamentally there is the same old ghost of purpose standing between us, unquote. So it is obvious that Skinner was quite aware of the experiments in artificially creating behavioral disorganization. The lever pressing situation relates to Skinner's animal training experiments. Indeed, he boasted, quote, I could make a pigeon a high achiever by reinforcing it on a proper schedule, unquote. He also wrote in Walden II, quote, we can achieve a sort of control under which the controlled, though they are following a code much more scrupulously than was ever the case under the old system, nevertheless feel free. So you can be controlled and feel free. They are doing what they want to do, not what they are forced to do. See, that's how they manage to get all these kids to do what they want. They make the kid think that they want to do what they're doing. That's the source of the tremendous power of positive reinforcement. There's no restraint and no revolt. By careful cultural design, we control not the final behavior, but the inclination to behave, the motives, desires, the wishes, unquote. Skinner also wrote, quote, give me a child and I will shape him into anything. That's why he's so dangerous. The anythings now control our culture. That is why America is in the mess it is. All of those anythings that Skinner created. They're running America now. They run the schools. They run everything. Skinner's colleague, Engelman, applied Skinnerian teaching principles to direct instruction, mastery learning, and to the OBE, outcome-based education curriculum. The reason they work so poorly is because of the complete absence of the spiritual component that must be part of education. You cannot educate a person without God. I don't care if you're an atheist, you don't believe and think you can be a well-educated atheist. But when it comes to children, you see, because godless atheist education leads to purposeless education. It's the sense of purpose that's missing. The computer is the perfect Skinner box because it connects directly with the student and can change his values. That is why the computer will prevail in the school, because of its ability to control the student's learning. Lauria's book describes how dyslexia is created by the clash between phonics and look-say. The phonics reader with a phonetic reflex automatically sees the phonetic structure of the written word, while the look-say reader with a whole word reflex automatically looks at each word as a picture and cannot see the phonetic structure of the word. The clash of reflexes causes dyslexia. In 1955, the reading problem had become so acute that Rudolf Flesch felt compelled to write his eye-opening bestseller, Why Johnny Can't Read. It gave the reason in no uncertain terms. Quote, "The teaching of reading all over the United States in all the schools and in all the textbooks is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense," unquote. And then he explained how the alphabetic phonics method, the proper way to teach children to read, had been replaced by a look-say whole word method that was causing untold harm to the children. What was the reaction of the professors of education? They circled the wagons and created the International Reading Association, which became the citadel of the whole word method. And they did everything in their power through their professional publications to denounce and discredit Flesch. In my book, The New Illiterates, I quote the professors ad nauseum. Nevertheless, Flesch's book awakened many parents, which led to a revival of phonics programs, but the reaction was not strong enough to derail the dumbing down process in the schools. In 1961, Watson Washburn, a New York attorney, created the Reading Reform Foundation and asked me to become a member of the National Advisory Council. At that time, I was an editor at Grosset and Dunlap and knew nothing about the reading problem. He advised me to read Flesch's book, and that's how I became involved in the reading problem. I attended all of the foundation's conferences, which of course were totally ignored by the reading establishment. However, knowing that millions of children were being denied proper phonics reading instruction, I decided to write a reading program that any parent could use to teach their child to read at home. The result was Alpha Phonics, which I considered to be the most effective, easiest to use, and least expensive reading program ever created. Meanwhile, the most noteworthy event in the mid-60s was the completion of Jean Charles' study of reading instruction methods and its publication in 1967 under the title, Learning to Read, The Great Debate. 3 years of intensive research confirmed what phonics proponents had known all along, that a phonics code emphasis method used in the beginning of reading instruction produced better readers than methods which began with a meaning emphasis, whole words. Since Charles' book was written for the teaching profession rather than the general public, it did not have the impact that Flesch's book had. She was criticized by the reading establishment and spent the rest of her professional life in constant conflict with them. You don't know how awful it is when you oppose the establishment. You probably do by now. In 1981, Flesch wrote another book, Why Johnny Still Can't Read, bringing the reading problem up to date. This time, the reading establishment completely ignored him. By then, the look-say method had morphed into the psycholinguistic method, and finally, the whole language method. A new generation of parents and teachers were as confused as ever when it came to reading instruction. Meanwhile, those parents who were informed enough to know what was going on left the public schools and began to homeschool. My Alpha Phonics program helped thousands of them teach their kids to read. As for the public schools, reading continued to deteriorate. In 1981, a Harvard professor, Dr. Anthony Ottinger, was bold enough to tell an audience of telecom executives, quote, "The present traditional concept of literacy has to do with the ability to read and write. Do we, for example, really want to teach people to do a lot of sums or write in a fine round hand when they have a $5 handheld calculator or a word processor to work with? Or do we really have to have everybody literate, writing and reading in the traditional sense, when we have the means through our technology to achieve a new flowering of oral communication?" Unquote. So here it is, he's saying, hey, do we have to have everybody literate anyway? The interesting thing about this is, though, why do we have compulsory school attendance? It was supposedly to make everybody literate. So if he believes, and his elitists at Harvard and the CFR believe that not everybody has to be illiterate, well, why are these kids being forced to go to school? And he advocated them reading comic books. Yes. And I don't know of any parent who sends a child to school to learn to read comic books. And if you've seen that movie, Waiting for Superman, where these parents are so anxious to get their kids into a charter school where they think they're going to be taught to read. These parents are they're just in such despair when they find out that their kids did not win the lottery, because these parents want their kids to become literate, because they know that that's the only road to economic advancement, is high literacy. And yet he says that, oh, we don't have to teach everybody to read, and we'll have this flowering of oral communication. You know what the oral communication is? Rap. That's the oral communication, you know, rap. And the minorities are very good at rap. So do we have to have everyone literate? That's the attitude of the elite. But then, why are we spending billions on public schools if it is not to make everyone literate? In 1983, we had the Nation at Risk report, which stated, quote, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves." Unquote. What the report is saying is that our educators are committing treason, and treason is a crime. You can be shot for committing treason. So finally, someone was actually identifying the treason of our educators. Did this alarming report change anything? According to Parents for Choice in Education, quote, "On the 25th anniversary of this sobering report, the American education system remains in a state of crisis. We are still a nation at risk. In 2008, the U.S. Department of Education released a report entitled A Nation Accountable, 25 years after a nation at risk, stating, quote, "If we were at risk in 1983, we are at even greater risk now. The rising demands of our global economy, together with demographic shifts, require that we educate more students to higher levels than ever before, yet our education system is not keeping pace with these growing demands," unquote. So things are worse now. Another crisis we have. What's the solution to the crisis? Money. More money. Not just millions, but billions. A year earlier, in November 2007, the National Endowment for the Arts issued an alarming report on the present state of literacy in America. The report was titled Reading at Risk. According to the report, the number of 17-year-olds who never read for pleasure increased from 9% in 1984 to 19% in 2004. About half of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 never read books for pleasure. Endowment Chairman Dana Joyer said, "This is a massive social problem. We are losing the majority of the new generation. They will not achieve anything close to their potential because of poor reading," unquote. The survey found that only a third of high school seniors read at a proficient level. Joyer goes on, and proficiency is not a high standard. We're not asking them to be able to read Proust in the original. We're talking about reading the daily newspaper, unquote. What was disappointing about the report is that it did not state the cause of this decline in national literacy. The refusal of our educators to use the time-tested traditional phonics reading instruction programs that once made Americans the most literate people on earth. And finally, this year, 2012, the Council on Foreign Relations has gotten into the act, issuing another alarming report on American education. The CFR task force was chaired by Joel I. Klein, former head of the New York City Public Schools, and Condoleezza Rice, former U.S. Secretary of State in the Bush administration, two very prominent members of the elite establishment. Klein had this to say about the reading problem in an interview conducted by John Meacham. He said, quote, "People ask me what surprised me most about being chancellor. I used to go to public schools in this city and walk into a high school and ask a kid to read, and the kid could not read. I don't mean even comprehend. I mean read the words on a text. How the hell can a kid be in a school system for a decade and not read? I mean, so you know this kid now, it may be that financial literacy will incentivize them, or entrepreneurism, or some other kind of project-driven work that should happen. But it's not going to win the 21st century to have kids in high schools who can't read," unquote. Now, when Klein was chancellor, I wrote him a letter with a proposal to help solve the school's reading problem by using alpha phonics to turn the worst school in the city into the best school in the city. I said, just let me do that. I'll be very glad to demonstrate how teaching the worst kids how to read in the proper way will turn it into the best school. Well, some months later, I received a very nice letter from Klein who said he appreciated my interest. And that was all. My proposal was not even considered. I made the same proposal, by the way, to that guy who runs the schools in Newark, the new mayor in Newark, New Jersey, who's gotten all this publicity, who got the $100 million from Zuckerberg at Facebook. I made the same offer. I said, give me the worst class in the city, and I will turn it into the best class. Well, the thing is, I've done everything in my power to get into the public schools, to let them know there is a way to solve your reading problem. They don't want to solve it. It's simple. It's a simple. I've come to that conclusion. But I make the effort simply because I feel that if I don't make the effort, people say, well, you never tried. You see, you never tried. So I do. I write the letters. I wrote to the Boston public schools who had the same problem. I wrote to the Newark. I wrote to Klein in New York. Get an answer, but it's, you know, thanks for your interest. We appreciate your interest, but that's about it. Which told me something about how constricted the members of the establishment are in considering true solutions to the problems they deal with. The solutions must be within the politically correct parameters, you see. And that is why the reforms offered by the CFR task force will get nowhere. Their main recommendation was for the schools to adopt Common Core standards. Concerning the Common Core idea, this is what a former Secretary of Education, Margaret Spelling, a member of the task force. This is what she had to say in the interview. She says, "I would target the Common Core effort because I do think that's the way out of the wilderness." They're in a wilderness. "But I couldn't do it with today, let's go try to do, get to millions of teachers on how to do it." By the way, she's grammatically a mess, because that's the way she speaks. We got to get, very smart and strategic with places like the College Board and the big publishers, the big technology companies, to get some research-based tools that are scalable and systematic. And so this idea that we can expect every single teacher, master teacher or otherwise, many of whom are not capable of doing this in the first place, to sort of do the magic in their own classroom is just unreasonable, period, paragraph. And so, we got to get smarter about that and then deploy it. I mean, I wouldn't even talk to the teachers about the Common Core at the moment until we get our act together about what it is and how it works, and materials around it and assessments built to it. Otherwise, I fear it's going to be one of those, quote, "we tried that and it did not work," unquote. That's the brains we have running education today. Considering the difficulties pointed out by spelling and implementing the Common Core throughout the education system, we can foresee that educator resistance will kill it. So there is no possibility of true education reform as long as the nation tolerates a public system of education that has literally become a highly organized criminal enterprise. What are its crimes? Its teaching methods injure children's brains, which is a form of child abuse. Wouldn't you say that that's child abuse? To injure a child's brain? And we now know that brain scans show the difference between dyslexic kids and normal kids. And also, since it's deliberately dumbing down the kids, it's deliberately dumbing down the nation. That's treason. That's a crime. Is that not so? So there's two crimes. The third crime, it contributes to the delinquency of minors with pornographic sex ed and the distribution of condoms. Don't you think giving kids condoms is encouraging delinquent behavior? Do you know that unwanted pregnancy is the worst social problem in America? The system destroys the child's religious beliefs and leads many students into atheism, nihilism, or self-destructive Satanism. Where do you think kids like the ones who massacred at Columbine came from? They came out of the public schools. They were perfectly normal kids who were attending an atheist school where Satanism runs rampant. I read a book on the subject, and they say that their minds began to change in their sophomore year. But nobody bothered to ask, what were they taught in the sophomore year? One of the killers in his diary kept quoting Nietzsche. Do they teach Nietzsche now in high school? And incidentally, these were two highly intelligent boys, very literate. You see, the rest of the dumbed-down kids, they can't read Nietzsche, so they're okay. They're not going to murder anybody. But these Nietzscheites who had adopted this negative philosophy, God is dead and all of that, and because they had this high intelligence, they decided that life was not worth living, and they're going to kill as many people as they can. The father of one of the boys, when he found out that it was his son, he said, "That's not my son." In other words, the parents were kept in the dark. And they weren't very curious about what their kids were doing. Why do you think there are massacres in schools, massacres in the United States? We didn't have that back in those days when I was going to school and the principal was reading the 23rd Psalm at assembly. We didn't have any killings. We didn't have teen suicide the way we have today with death education, So that's another crime. It may be not a a crime that will send you to jail to destroy the religious beliefs of a person. But from my point of view, because it leads to criminal behavior, it's a kind of crime. Here's another crime committed by the schools. They push drugs. You heard of Ritalin? Have you heard of Adderall? Yeah. And other drugs. If you did that in the street, you'd be thrown in jail, you'd be prosecuted. But they do it in the schools. The kids have been artificially disorganized by the system, and so they have to use drugs in order to keep the kids sitting in the classroom and accepting more of the garbage. Then the final crime is extortion. The educators extort billions of dollars in the name of education, and they're not educating. And they're very clever at that. And that's what all of these crises are about. That's why you have a nation at risk. You've got Fellowship for the Arts. You've got the CFR getting into it because that's the only way they can get more money. Because the solution is always give us more money. Do you know what they estimate the standards, these new Common Core standards, is going to cost? It's going to cost something like $60 billion. And we know it's not going to work. They're going to get the money, though, because we've got a stupid Congress, and we have all these venal congressmen who will vote for anything that Obama tells them to vote for. It has become a criminal enterprise from every point of view. And we ought to tell it like it is. We ought to tell the public, you're sending your kids to a criminal enterprise when you put them in a public school, because this is what they're going to do to your kid. So where do we go from here? We should work to get the public schools back under local control. We must shut down the computerized data collection system on all students in America. In short, we must get the federal government out of the education business and restore the schools to the people in the communities who pay for them and send their children to them. And that's my message. That's the least that we can do, is to help get the federal government out of the education system. Now, once it gets back into local control, then we can work on trying to get some decent curriculum in the school. But I don't see any other solution to this problem. Well, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.